Good afternoon. Continuing my conversations about South Carolina history, I'd like to talk this afternoon about South Carolina and the Declaration of Independence. And when I first put this talk together, it was a while back, but it was at a naturalization ceremony down in Charleston. And that afternoon, the Declaration was read, but individuals from 60 different nations took the oath of allegiance to become citizens of the United States. And, I thought how appropriate for that to be in South Carolina, where our colonial population was the most diverse. And we literally were a living symbol of e pluribus unum, out of many, one nation. Okay, now to the Declaration itself. On the 7th of June, 1776, the Virginia delegation proposed a Declaration of Independence. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina said that such a declaration was premature. And so on July the 1st, Congress voted, and it was divided. New York declined to vote. The Delaware delegation was divided, which meant its vote didn't count. Pennsylvania voted no. South Carolina voted no. The next day, on July the 2nd, South Carolina changed its vote, as did the other states, so that the document's opening phrase, the unanimous declaration of the 13 states of America, was not just hyperbole, but a fact. Now, in 1776, South Carolina was no stranger to strong talk or action. July 1776 was just one of the many times the Carolinians had asserted themselves against what they had viewed as tyranny and oppression. Go back to December 1719, when the colonials had a successful coup d'etat to overthrow the Lords Proprietors. This was the only real revolution in colonial America. Why? I'll let the men of 1719 speak for themselves. English do not rebel without justifying their actions, and it was true back home and here in South Carolina. There was a catalog of grievances against the Lord Proprietors, including something that had changed the nature and membership of the council, which is a change in government, vetoing needed legislation, and not responding to the needs of the colonists. And the very opening paragraph, resolved that we act as a convention delegated by the people to prevent the utter ruin of this government, if not the loss of this province. And be it resolved that the Lord Proprietors have by their proceedings unhinged the frame of government and forfeited their right to the same. William Rhett, a proprietor loyalist, warned imperial officials to quash this rebellion. And he made a prediction: if you don't squash this one and crop it in the bud, and that was his phrase, crop it in the bud, and make an example of some of these, they will set themselves up against His Majesty as well as the proprietors. And of course he was right, but he was just 60 years too soon. Rhett's warning went unheeded, and the Revolution of 1719 succeeded. But Rhett was an accurate prophet that the Carolinians, if given a loose rein, would chart their own course, and they did. In 1735, in a dispute with the Governor and Royal Council over control of the public treasury, the Commons House of Assembly resolved that the Commons House of Assembly of this province have the rights, powers, and privileges in regard to introducing and passing laws for imposing taxes on the people of this province, as the House of Commons in Great Britain have in introducing and passing laws on the people of England. Technically, folks, that was treason. Nobody was equal. Parliament was the power. But this is 1735, and the South Carolinians are saying, no, we are equal to Parliament. And then you skip up 3 decades to the Stamp Act crisis. Colonial Assembly, First Continental Colonial Assembly, met to discuss the Stamp Act, which was imposing a tax on all of the colonies. And they adopted a kind of mealy-mouthed resolution. But South Carolina's Commons House wasn't so reticent. It resolved that His Majesty's subjects in this province are entitled to all of the inherent rights and liberties of his natural-born subjects within the Kingdom of Great Britain. That is essential to the freedom of the people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed upon them but with the consent given personally or by their representatives. That the only representatives of the people of this province are persons chosen by themselves, and that no taxes ever have been or can be constitutionally imposed upon them but by the legislature of this province, and that it is the right of British subjects in this province to petition the King or either House of Parliament. Now, in those resolutions, you can hear things that were bandied about 10 years later on the eve of the American Revolution. No taxation without representation. The rights of Englishmen. We can only be represented by people we elect, because one of the arguments in Parliament was that they virtually represented the colonies because they were part of the empire. So here is South Carolina making very strong stands about what they believed the rights of the citizens of South Carolina were before it became fashionable nationwide. And the Commons House then had their remarks printed and distributed throughout the colony. To the colony's agent in London, the Carolinians were even more outspoken. In taxing ourselves and making laws for our own internal government or police, we can by no means allow our provincial legislatures to be subordinate to any legislative power on earth. Again, folks, that's pretty close to treason. Now, this was not just the Low Country elite that dominated the Commons House who felt this way. It was unanimous across the colony. In 1774, a grand jury in Camden made a startling declaration of American liberty, which predates the so-called Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. It says, "We present a grievance of the most dangerous and alarming nature, the power of the Parliament to tax, to make whatever laws to bind the American colonies in all cases. And we are resolved to maintain our constitutional rights at the hazards of our lives and fortunes." Phraseology that you're going to hear in the Declaration of Independence. And our constitutional rights are dearer to us than our lives and fortunes. Actions, not words. Words were easy. In 1769, the Commons House voted £1,500 probably about $250,000, for the Society for the Support of the Bill of Rights of England. It was really a defense fund for John Wilkes, a newspaperman who allegedly had insulted the king in the press. Imperial officials were outraged and said the Commons House could do no such thing. And the Commons House took up the challenge. "We will not give in to the unjust and unconstitutional measures of an arbitrary and oppressive ministry." And folks, after 1771, for all practical purposes, royal government in South Carolina was on the way out. In 1773, there was a mass meeting response to the landing of the tea, which was really the first step in beginning to form an independent government. In June of 1774, South Carolinians elected delegates to the First Continental Congress. John Rutledge, who had been a delegate to the Stamp Act Congress. Edward Rutledge, defender of the publisher of the South Carolina Gazette in a legal action against the Royal Council. All of us who had history lessons know about Peter Zenger in New York and what have you. Well, guess what? That happened in South Carolina. It just hadn't made all of the history books. Christopher Gadsden, had been a delegate to the Stamp Act Congress. So had Thomas Lynch. And Arthur Middleton, a member of the Royal Council who had voted to open South Carolina's ports without stamps, resigned from the council and joined a non-importation association. So these are members of South Carolina's social and political elite who are standing up for revolution, who've already got a track record in 1774 of being on the cusp of being called revolutionaries. In November 1774, there were elections for what was now called the Provincial Congress. There was a mission to the backcountry to get them to participate. Very early the next year, in 1775, the last royal governor, Governor Campbell, flees. And in 96, this is still 1775, in 96, the first blood of the American Revolution is shed in South Carolina when a Tory militia attacks a Patriot supply train. And that was followed by the so-called Snow Campaign, when Colonel Richard Richardson tracked down the Tories. Literally the Snow Campaign, because it was so cold, snow remained on the ground for almost a month. And so they literally could track the Tories through the snow and brought temporary peace, at least to the backcountry. So before the Declaration, blood has already been shed in South Carolina in support of the Revolution. March 1776, South Carolina becomes only the second colony and the first Southern colony to write a constitution. March 1776, that's months before the Declaration of Independence. And part of that declaration was the colonists have been driven to the necessity of taking up arms. And part of the Constitution said, well, maybe there can be an accommodation, but this is going to be our basic law of government until an accommodation is reached. And then, June the 28th, the battle at Sullivan's Island. I don't think I need to describe the heroics there, the Palmetto Fort, William Moultrie, or Danger Thompson from Orangeburg. Actually, it was he and his sharpshooters who really kept the British from crossing over Breeches Inlet. So, again, we haven't got a Declaration of Independence. We've had a major battle in South Carolina. Congress passes it on July the 4th. It was not until August the 5th that actually the news reached Charleston, and it was received with mixture of great joy and some sadness. The formal break with Great Britain was traumatic for many South Carolinians. Henry Laurens, who at that time was Vice President of South Carolina, later wrote that when he learned of the Declaration, I wept that day as I had for the melancholy catastrophe which caused me to put on black clothes, the death of a son, and felt much more pain. Now, this did not mean that Laurens was any less patriotic. It meant for those like Laurens, who were cosmopolitan citizens of the world's greatest empire, that it was the end of an era, the end of their world as they knew it. There was a grand procession led by President John Rutledge through the streets of Charleston, and all the military units in the city paraded. And the parade ended at the Liberty Tree, where the Declaration was read to the assembled throng. And now I'd like to discuss portions of the Declaration and relationship with South Carolina. First of all, starting with the preamble. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. If you'll just remember back to my earlier remarks about 1719, how that revolution, the South Carolinians justified their revolution against the proprietors. of course, they spent a lot of time attacking King George. And among his, it's interesting they attack King George. They know the power's Parliament, but attacking Parliament is kind of like, what have you really got your hands on? But King George became the tyrant. Everything was directed at the king. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. South Carolina's Commons House had had a long-running battle with imperial authorities over legislation that had been disallowed in London, especially things like the Circuit Court Act of 1768 to bring jails, judges, and courts to the backcountry. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless these people would relinquish the rights of representation in the legislature. Imperial authorities had disallowed acts creating St. Luke and All Saints Parish, and more adequate representation for the backcountry in St. Mark's and St. David's was kept minimal. What Parliament, through its ministers, was saying, not really the king, but British government had said, we've decided that your Commons House can only have so many members. If you want to create a new district for the backcountry, you've got to take representation from somebody else. That didn't go very well. He has called together legislative bodies at unusual places, uncomfortable and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. This specifically related to South Carolina. While the others were fairly universal, this one was South Carolina specific. In 1772, Governor Charles Montague called the assembly to meet in Beaufort in the hopes that it could be away from Charleston's revolutionaries, and it would then do his bidding. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Normally, the South Carolina Commons House held elections every 3 years. There were 33 royal assemblies. 11, or 1/3 of those, were elected in the last 15 years that South Carolina was having a royal colony. And there were 6 elections between 1768 and 1773. The Commons House would meet, they would take up something the government didn't like, so they'd dissolve it and call for new elections. 6 elections in 4 years. Elections necessitated by governors' dissolutions of assembly. When the Commons House voted to take up the Massachusetts circular letter, Governor Montague dissolved the assembly. The 13th Royal Assembly in April 1772 lasted 8 days. The 31st Royal Assembly, October and November 1772, and the 33rd and the 32nd Royal Assembly, January 73, lasted only 8 days. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Again, going back to the Circuit Court Act of 1768, when South Carolina was trying to extend justice to the backcountry, which of course the backcountry wanted. He has made judges dependent upon his will alone for the tenure of their office. Now this was the real sticking point of the 1768, because under British law and tradition, a judge was appointed by the king for the king's behavior, or actually for good behavior. So if you made a decision the king didn't like or his attorney general didn't like, you could probably be kicked out of your judgeship. South Carolina tried, as did New York and New Jersey, to basically make, when we say good behavior, that means once they get appointed for good behavior, you can't take them out of office. In 1769, one of the assistant judges of the colony made a stirring charge to the grand jury on the progress that South Carolina had made from dreary wilderness to the most opulent and flourishing colony on the British continent. And he concluded, all of this has been done without one farthing of expense or charge to the mother country. 2 years later, Pringle was removed from the bench because Lieutenant Governor Bull said he was a subscriber to the American Association. And though also not so active as others, his discourses countenancing unconstitutional prejudices have not failed to make an impression on grand juries and audiences. Others were removed, including Rawlins Lowndes and George Gabriel Powell, for unconstitutional prejudices. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. The South Carolina Constitution of 1776 contained the phrases, "And whereas large fleets and armies have been sent to America in order to compel an absolute submission to the will of a corrupt and despotic administration, and in consequences thereof hostilities have been commenced." Remember, in 1775, blood had already been shed in South Carolina by the time that was written. He has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. South Carolina's 1776 Constitution included the phrase, "instigated and encouraged the Indian nations to war against the colonies." Colonel John Stewart of South Carolina, who was the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Southern Colonies, had fled Charleston for Pensacola, and constant rumors were that he was stirring up the frontier. And in July 1776, the Cherokee and some Tory militia launched raids all along the Carolina frontier. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Since the 1730s, the Commons House had been sending resolutions and remonstrances to London on a regular basis. And the colony's agent in London, and all colonies had an agent paid for by the colonies to basically be their lobbyist, their representative in dealing with the king, the ministers, parliamentary committees, and the like. South Carolina's agents were directed repeatedly to lobby with imperial officials to change policies and our royal appointments. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And it was signed by Thomas Hayward Jr., Thomas Lynch Jr., who had joined the delegation. His father, Thomas Lynch Sr., was also a member of the Continental Congress. Arthur Middleton and Edward Rutledge all signed. Thomas Lynch Sr. was paralyzed, but a spot was left for him if he recovered to be able to sign. He did not. If you look at the declaration, there literally is a space in the South Carolina delegation where Thomas Lynch Sr. could have signed had he been physically able. Note the similarity in language between the ringing closing phrase of the Declaration and the Camden Ground Jury's presentment of 1774, in which the men who signed the document said that our constitutional rights are dearer to us than our lives and fortunes. South Carolina and the Declaration. The document proclaimed what was already a fact here. By the time the Declaration arrived, South Carolina was basically already independent. Blood had been shed on the frontier and in Charleston Harbor. A constitution had been adopted. A functioning government had been established. The Declaration of Independence, it's a marvelous document, beautifully written, a charter of liberty broadcast to an unbelieving world in 1776. What is often overlooked in discussions of the document is how pervasive the sentiments were, especially here in South Carolina. How fortunate we are to have this marvelous copy here in South Carolina. We do have one of the early copies, handwritten copies of the Declaration, hand printed in South Carolina. It's a tangible link to our founding fathers who were willing to sacrifice their all for American independence. And on that note, I think I'll stop for today. But we all grew up in studying the Declaration of Independence, and it all happened in Philadelphia. They quote John Adams, and they quote this person, and they quote that person. South Carolinians were saying much of the same thing years before. So I think I do. I am going to stop this time, and I look forward to our conversation next week.